She was invisible to everyone in the mansion, except the one man who could destroy her life with a single word. Evelyn Carter thought she knew her place, polishing silver, arranging flowers, staying silent in the shadows of Charleston's most powerful family. But when Thomas Whitmore returned home unexpectedly, everything she believed about boundaries, forbidden desires, and impossible dreams shattered like crystal on marble floors. What started as stolen conversations in an empty kitchen would soon ignite a scandal that would tear apart generations of family tradition, expose devastating secrets, and force everyone to choose between love and loyalty. Little did Evelyn know that her quiet act of courage would unleash consequences that would change not just her destiny, but the fate of the entire Whitmore legacy forever. If you're hooked and want to see how this forbidden love story unfolds, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Evelyn Carter moved through the grand hallway like a whisper, her soft-soled shoes making no sound as she carried fresh linens toward the master bedroom. At 27, she had perfected the art of being invisible, a skill that served her well in her job as the live-in maid for one of the wealthiest families in Charleston. She paused at the ornate mirror in the hallway, adjusting the simple white headband that kept her dark curls neat and professional. Her reflection showed a woman with gentle brown eyes and smooth skin, someone who had learned to keep her thoughts to herself and her presence unnoticed. That was how things worked in the Whitmore house. The help stayed quiet, stayed out of the way, and kept the family's world running smoothly. Evelyn had been working here for 3 years now, ever since she'd answered an ad in the newspaper for a live-in position. The small apartment above the garage suited her just fine, and the pay was better than anything she could find in town. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore ran a tight ship, expecting perfection in everything from the way the silver was polished to how the flowers were arranged in the front parlor. The house itself was like something from a magazine. All tall ceilings, antique furniture, and rooms that seemed too fancy for actual living. Sometimes Evelyn wondered what it would feel like to walk through these halls as a guest instead of staff, to sit on the velvet sofas in the living room instead of dusting them. She shook off the thought and continued with her morning routine. The Whitmore family was away on vacation, which meant she could work at her own pace without worrying about staying out of sight. Mrs. Margaret and Mr. Henry had gone to visit relatives up north, taking their usual entourage of expectations and social obligations with them. Their son Thomas was supposed to be with them for another week, but Evelyn had learned not to count on the schedules of wealthy people. They changed plans like other folks changed clothes. She was humming softly to herself as she arranged fresh towels in the guest bathroom when she heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Evelyn froze, listening to the crunch of gravel and the slam of a car door. No one was supposed to be home yet. Moving quickly to the window, she peered through the curtain and saw a black sedan parked near the front entrance. A tall figure was pulling a suitcase from the trunk, moving with the unhurried confidence that only came from being home. Thomas Whitmore had returned early. Evelyn's heart did a little skip, though she couldn't say exactly why. She'd only met Thomas a handful of times during her 3 years of employment. He traveled frequently for business and spent most of his time in the city when he wasn't away entirely. When he was home, he kept to himself mostly, polite but distant with the staff. She remembered him as quiet and serious, with dark hair that was always perfectly styled, and clothes that probably cost more than she made in a month. He had kind eyes, though, something soft in them that set him apart from his parents' sharp business manner. Evelyn hurried downstairs to the main floor, straightening her apron as she went. She should greet him properly, maybe ask if he needed anything. That was part of her job, after all. She found him in the front hallway, setting his suitcase down and looking around the quiet house with something like relief on his face. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Welcome home. We weren't expecting you until next week." He turned toward her voice, and for a moment, something passed across his features. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Evelyn, right?" he said, and she was touched that he remembered her name. "I decided to cut the trip short. Too much family togetherness, if you know what I mean." There was a hint of humor in his voice that she'd never heard before, and it made her smile despite herself. I understand, sir. Can I get you anything? Some coffee, maybe? You must be tired from traveling. Coffee sounds perfect, he said, loosening his tie. And please, just Thomas is fine. All that sir business makes me feel like my father. Evelyn nodded, though she doubted Mrs. Margaret would approve of such informality. I'll have it ready in just a few minutes. Would you like it in the study? Actually, Thomas said, following her toward the kitchen, I think I'll have it wherever you usually drink your coffee. I could use some normal conversation after a week of discussing proper table settings and social connections. The comment surprised her. In all her time working here, none of the Whitmores had ever shown any interest in where or how she spent her breaks. She glanced back at him, wondering if this was some kind of test. I usually just have my coffee in the kitchen, Mr. Thomas, she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue. Are you sure that's what you'd prefer? Positive, he said, settling himself on one of the stools at the kitchen island like it was the most natural thing in the world. Evelyn busied herself with the coffee maker, very aware of his presence in her workspace. The kitchen was her domain, the one place in the house where she felt completely comfortable and in control. Having Thomas here shifted something, made the familiar space feel different. Your parents will be back next Tuesday, she said, filling the silence as the coffee brewed. Mrs. Margaret left a list of things she wanted done while they were away. I've been working through it. I'm sure you have, Thomas said. My mother's lists are legendary. I think she started making them before I could even read. There was that hint of humor again, gentle and self-aware. Evelyn found herself relaxing slightly as she poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the island to him. Thank you, he said, wrapping his hands around the mug. This is exactly what I needed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen windows and warming the space between them. Evelyn sipped her coffee and tried to figure out what was different about this interaction. Thomas seemed less formal than she remembered, more like a regular person than the distant heir to the Whitmore fortune. Can I ask you something? Thomas said suddenly. Evelyn looked up, meeting his eyes across the kitchen island. Of course. Do you like working here? The question caught her off guard. It was direct in a way that the Whitmores usually weren't, practical rather than polite. It's a good job, she said carefully. Your family has been fair to me. That's not what I asked, Thomas said gently. I asked if you like it. Evelyn considered the question, rolling it around in her mind like she might roll a smooth stone between her fingers. No employer had ever asked her that before. I like taking care of things, she said finally, making sure everything runs smoothly. There's something satisfying about that. Thomas nodded as if her answer made perfect sense to him. I understand that feeling. There's peace in having everything in its proper place. Exactly, Evelyn said, surprised by how well he'd captured it. Most people don't understand that. Most people haven't spent their whole lives in houses where everything has to be perfect all the time, Thomas said. Sometimes I think the only honest conversations I have are with people who work to make other people's lives easier. There was something sad in the way he said it, a loneliness that Evelyn recognized. She'd felt it herself sometimes, moving through the world of the wealthy as someone who was essential but invisible. Your family cares about you, she said, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to reassure him. They care about the idea of me, Thomas corrected, the version of me that fits their plans and meets their expectations. The real me is a little more complicated than that. Evelyn understood, complicated. She understood the feeling of being seen only for the role you played, rather than the person you were underneath. We all have parts of ourselves that don't fit other people's expectations, she said. Thomas looked at her with new interest, as if he was really seeing her for the first time. That's very wise. My grandmother used to say that everyone has a story that would surprise you if you took the time to hear it, Evelyn said. I think she was right. I'd like to hear your story sometime, Thomas said, and there was something sincere in his voice that made Evelyn's pulse quicken. She looked down at her coffee cup, suddenly aware that they were crossing into territory that might not be appropriate. I should let you get settled in, she said. You probably have things to do. Actually, Thomas said, not moving from his stool, I don't have anything pressing to do for the first time in months. That's part of why I came home early. I realized I've been running from one obligation to the next without ever stopping to think about what I actually want. What do you want? Evelyn asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gardens beyond. I want to have conversations like this one, he said finally. Real ones, with people who see the world differently than I do. Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. I should warn you, she said, attempting to lighten the mood. I don't know much about business or high society. My conversations tend to be pretty ordinary. Ordinary sounds perfect, Thomas said, and when he smiled, Evelyn felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she hadn't even realized was closed. That evening, Evelyn found herself thinking about their conversation as she prepared a simple dinner. Thomas had excused himself to unpack and make some phone calls, but not before asking if she would mind his company again tomorrow. The request had been polite but hopeful, and she'd agreed before she could think too much about whether it was wise. She was setting a place for him at the kitchen table when he appeared in the doorway, having changed from his traveling clothes into jeans and a simple button-down shirt. The casual clothes made him look younger, more approachable. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. I could eat in the dining room if you prefer. The kitchen's fine, Evelyn said, meaning it. I made pot roast. Nothing fancy, but it's filling. It smells incredible, Thomas said, taking the seat she indicated. I've been eating restaurant food for weeks. Home cooking sounds like heaven. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily from topic to topic. Books they'd both read, places they'd liked to travel, childhood memories that had shaped them. Evelyn found herself laughing more than she had in months, surprised by Thomas's dry sense of humor and his genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. I have a confession, Thomas said as Evelyn served slices of the apple pie she'd made that morning. I was dreading coming back here. This house can feel like a museum sometimes, beautiful but not very alive. But tonight has been different. Different how? Evelyn asked. Warmer, Thomas said simply. More real, like a home instead of a showplace. Evelyn felt a flutter of pride at the compliment, followed immediately by a twinge of worry. This easy intimacy they'd fallen into felt natural and right, but she knew it existed in a bubble that might not survive the return of his parents. Your family will be back soon, she said, not sure if she was reminding him or herself. I know, Thomas said, but that doesn't change anything about tonight, does it? He was looking at her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter, and Evelyn realized that somewhere between the coffee that afternoon and the pie they were sharing now, something important had shifted between them. No, she said quietly. I suppose it doesn't. Later that night, as Evelyn cleaned up the kitchen and Thomas read in the living room, she allowed herself to think about what was happening. She'd spent 3 years in this house being careful, professional, invisible, but Thomas made her feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She knew better than most that good things didn't usually last for people like her. But as she turned off the lights and headed up to her small apartment, she found herself hoping that maybe, just this once, things might be different. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway just as she was hanging up the dish towel, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the space. Thank you, he said, for dinner, for the conversation, for making this place feel like home. You're welcome, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Would it be all right if we did this again tomorrow? He asked. I mean, if you don't have other plans. Evelyn smiled, feeling brave in the soft light of the kitchen. I'd like that. After he'd gone upstairs, Evelyn stood alone in the quiet kitchen and admitted to herself what she'd been trying not to think all evening. She was developing feelings for Thomas Whitmore, and despite every practical reason why it was impossible, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The next morning brought rain and the kind of gray light that made the house feel cozy rather than grand. Evelyn woke earlier than usual, taking extra care with her appearance in a way that she told herself was just professional pride. She found Thomas already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, standing by the window with a cup of coffee and watching the rain fall on the gardens. Good morning, she said, pleased by how normal her voice sounded. Morning, he said, turning toward her with a smile that made her heart skip. I hope you don't mind that I started the coffee. I'm an early riser by nature. That's perfectly fine, Evelyn said. Would you like some breakfast? Only if you're making some for yourself, Thomas said. I don't want to create extra work. As they prepared breakfast together, moving around each other in the kitchen with surprising ease, Evelyn realized that this domestic intimacy was exactly what she'd been missing without knowing it. For years, she'd taken care of other people's homes and lives, but she'd never shared the simple pleasure of making a meal with someone who wanted her company as much as her service. "Can I ask you something personal?" Thomas said as they sat down to eat. Evelyn nodded, though her stomach tightened slightly. "What made you want to do this kind of work?" The question was gentler than she'd expected, and she took a moment to consider her answer. "I needed a job that came with a place to live," she said honestly, "but I stayed because I'm good at it, and because there's dignity in taking care of things properly." "There is," Thomas agreed, "more dignity than in a lot of what passes for important work in my world." "What do you do?" Evelyn asked. She knew he worked for the family business, but she'd never been clear on the details. "Investment management mostly," Thomas said. "I spend my days moving money around to make more money for people who already have more money than they need." "That doesn't sound very fulfilling," Evelyn observed. "It's not," Thomas said with a rueful laugh, "but it's what's expected of me, the Whitmore legacy and all that." "What would you do if you could choose anything?" Evelyn asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and she wondered if she'd overstepped. But then he said, "I think I'd like to teach. History, maybe, or literature, something that actually matters to people." "Why don't you?" "Because Thomas Whitmore doesn't become a public school teacher," he said. But there was no bitterness in it, just resignation. "Some dreams are more expensive than others." Evelyn understood that kind of practical surrender, the way life sometimes required you to choose security over dreams. But seeing it in Thomas, who had every advantage she'd never had, made her unexpectedly sad. "It's not too late," she said impulsively. "You could still make a different choice." "Maybe," Thomas said, but he was looking at her in a way that made her think he was considering possibilities he'd given up on long ago. They spent the rest of the morning working together in comfortable companionship, Thomas helping her with small tasks around the house while they talked about everything and nothing. By lunchtime, Evelyn had almost forgotten about the complications that would inevitably arise when his parents returned. Almost, but not quite. That afternoon, as they sat in the garden reading, Thomas with a business journal, Evelyn with a novel from the Whitmore Library, she caught herself stealing glances at him and wondering what he was thinking. Evelyn," he said suddenly, not looking up from his magazine. "Yes?" "I'm glad I came home early." The simple statement sent warmth flooding through her chest. "So am I," she said. When he looked up and met her eyes, Evelyn saw something there that made her breath catch. Interest, yes, but also a kind of recognition, as if he was seeing in her the same possibility for connection that she was feeling toward him. "We should probably talk about what happens when my parents get back," Thomas said gently. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I don't want these past few days to be just a pleasant interlude," Thomas said. "I like spending time with you, Evelyn. I like who I am when I'm with you." "Thomas," she began, but he held up a hand. "I know it's complicated," he said. "I know there are 100 reasons why it doesn't make sense, but I also know that I haven't felt this comfortable with anyone in years, maybe ever." Evelyn's heart was beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. "Your parents won't understand." "My parents don't understand a lot of things about me," Thomas said. "That doesn't mean I have to live my life according to their expectations." The conviction in his voice made something hopeful bloom in Evelyn's chest, but she forced herself to be practical. "This job is important to me. I can't afford to lose it." "You won't lose it," Thomas said firmly, "not because of me." "You can't promise that." "Yes, I can," Thomas said, and there was steel in his voice that reminded her he was, after all, a Whitmore. "This is my home too, and I have a say in how things are run here." Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the quiet strength she saw in him, but she'd learned early in life that wanting something didn't make it possible. "Let's just see what happens," she said carefully. Thomas nodded, seeming to understand that pushing too hard would only make her retreat further. "All right. But Evelyn?" "Yes?" "Whatever happens, I want you to know that these days have meant something to me. You mean something to me." The words hung in the air between them, more honest and intimate than anything Evelyn had expected from Thomas Whitmore when she'd first seen him walk through the front door 3 days ago. "You mean something to me, too," she said quietly, and saw relief and something deeper flash across his features. That evening, their last before his parents' return, they lingered over dinner longer than usual, neither of them wanting to acknowledge that their bubble of intimacy was about to be tested by the return of the real world. "Tomorrow changes things," Evelyn said finally. "It doesn't have to," Thomas said. "Not if we don't let it." Evelyn hoped he was right, but as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was about to come to an end. The question was whether what they'd found together would be strong enough to survive the storm that was coming. Outside her window, the rain had stopped, but the morning would bring new challenges that would test whether the connection between a maid and the heir to a family fortune could survive the judgment of a world that believed some boundaries should never be crossed. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway announced the return of Margaret and Henry Whitmore with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard the familiar rhythm of Mrs. Margaret's heels clicking across the marble foyer, followed by the deeper measured steps of Mr. Henry. Thomas had been reading in the morning room, but Evelyn could hear him moving toward the front of the house to greet his parents. She smoothed her apron and checked her appearance in the small mirror by the kitchen door, reminding herself to slip back into the invisible role she'd mastered over the past 3 years. "Thomas, darling," Mrs. Margaret's voice carried through the house with its usual commanding warmth. "We weren't expecting you until this evening. How long have you been home?" "A few days," Thomas replied, and Evelyn could hear the careful neutrality in his tone. "I decided to cut the trip short." "Well, I hope Evelyn has been taking proper care of you," Mrs. Margaret said, and Evelyn felt her stomach tighten at the mention of her name. "Where is she? We need to discuss the dinner menu for tonight." Evelyn took a deep breath and walked toward the foyer, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore," she said with a slight bow of her head. "Welcome home." Margaret Whitmore was a handsome woman of 62, with silver hair always perfectly styled, and clothes that whispered money rather than shouted it. Her sharp eyes took in everything at once: the state of the house, Thomas's casual clothes, the way Evelyn stood perhaps a little too comfortably in the family's space. "Evelyn," Mrs. Margaret said with a smile that was polite but assessing, "the house looks lovely. I trust everything went smoothly while we were away." "Yes, ma'am," Evelyn replied. "I completed all the tasks on your list. The silver has been polished, the carpets cleaned, and I've been keeping fresh flowers in the main rooms." "Excellent," Mrs. Margaret said, but her gaze shifted to Thomas, and Evelyn caught something questioning in her expression. "Thomas, you look rested. Country air agrees with you." "Something like that," Thomas said, and when his eyes met Evelyn's across the foyer, she saw a flicker of warmth that made her pulse quicken and her worry deepen at the same time. Henry Whitmore, a distinguished man of 65 with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Good to see you, son. We have some business matters to discuss when you have a moment." "Of course," Thomas said, "but first, let me help you get settled." As the family moved toward the stairs with their luggage, Evelyn retreated to the kitchen, trying to process the shift in atmosphere. The easy intimacy she and Thomas had shared over the past few days suddenly felt like something fragile and exposed, likely to be damaged by too much scrutiny. She was arranging flowers when Lydia Barnes appeared in the kitchen doorway. Lydia was the household manager, a sharp-eyed woman of 29 who had worked for the Whitmores for 5 years. She handled schedules, coordinated with other staff, and generally made sure the household ran with military precision. She was also the closest thing Evelyn had to a friend in this house. "How did it go with Thomas?" Lydia asked without preamble, settling herself on one of the kitchen stools. "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, though her cheeks warmed. "I mean that Thomas Whitmore spent 3 days in this house with only you for company, and now Mrs. Margaret is asking pointed questions about whether anything unusual happened while they were away." Evelyn's hand stilled on the flowers. "She asked you that?" "Not directly," Lydia said, "but I've worked for this family long enough to know when they're fishing for information. So I'll ask again. How did it go?" Evelyn considered lying, but Lydia would see through it immediately. "He was different than I expected. Kinder, more down to earth." "Different how?" He helped with chores. We ate meals together in the kitchen. We talked about books and normal things. Evelyn's voice grew softer. He made me feel like my thoughts mattered. Lydia was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Evelyn, honey, you need to be careful. I know, Evelyn said quickly. I know it's complicated. It's not just complicated, Lydia said gently. It's dangerous. Not because Thomas is a bad person. I actually think he's the best of the Whitmores. But because his parents have very specific ideas about what his life should look like, and those ideas don't include getting attached to the help. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. Did Mrs. Margaret say something specific? She asked if Thomas seemed distracted while they were away, if he spent time in areas of the house where he normally wouldn't go. Lydia's eyes were kind but serious. She's not stupid, Evelyn. She notices things. That afternoon, the dynamic in the house shifted back to its familiar patterns. Thomas joined his parents in the study for business discussions, and Evelyn found herself relegated to the background again, invisible and efficient. But she could feel the change in the air, a tension that hadn't existed during their peaceful interlude. At dinner time, she prepared the meal and set the table in the formal dining room, then retreated to the kitchen to eat. Her own simple meal alone. It was the way things had always been, but after sharing easy conversation and laughter with Thomas over the past few days, the isolation felt sharper than usual. She was washing dishes when Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie with an expression of frustration. "How was dinner?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Long," Thomas said, moving to stand beside her at the sink. "My mother spent an hour telling me about the daughters of various family friends who would make suitable companions for social events." Evelyn's hands paused in their work. "I see. I told her I wasn't interested in being set up," Thomas continued, which led to a lecture about my responsibilities to the family name and the importance of making appropriate connections. The word appropriate hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Evelyn's chest tight. "She's your mother," Evelyn said carefully. "She wants what's best for you." "She wants what looks best for the family," Thomas corrected. "That's not always the same thing." He moved closer, and Evelyn could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth of his presence beside her. "I missed talking to you today," he said quietly. "Thomas," she began, but he interrupted her. "I know what you're going to say, that we have to be careful, that this is complicated, that your job is important." His voice was gentle but determined. "And you're right about all of that. But I also know that I've never connected with anyone the way I have with you." Evelyn turned to face him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes and feeling her resolve weaken. "Your parents are home now. Things are different." "They don't have to be," Thomas said. "Not completely." Before she could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Thomas stepped back immediately, creating proper distance between them, but not before Evelyn caught the flash of something in his eyes. Frustration, maybe, or sadness at the necessity of hiding what was between them. Mrs. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her gaze moving between Thomas and Evelyn with barely concealed curiosity. "Thomas, there you are. Your father wants to discuss the Henderson account with you." "Of course," Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was just thanking Evelyn for keeping the house in such good order while you were away." "Yes," Mrs. Margaret said, her smile sharp. "Evelyn is very thorough. We're quite fortunate to have such dedicated help." The emphasis on the word help was subtle but clear, and Evelyn felt herself shrinking back into her familiar role. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. Will there be anything else tonight?" "That will be all," Mrs. Margaret said. "You've done enough for one day." After they left, Evelyn finished the dishes with hands that weren't quite steady. The message had been delivered politely but unmistakably. She was the help, Thomas was the heir, and everyone needed to remember their proper places. The next few days fell into a tense rhythm. Thomas was pulled into family business during the day and social obligations in the evenings, leaving little opportunity for the easy conversations they'd shared. When they did encounter each other, it was under the watchful eyes of his parents or other staff members, forcing them to maintain careful distance. Evelyn threw herself into her work, trying to ignore the way her heart jumped every time she heard Thomas's voice in another room or caught a glimpse of him through a doorway. She told herself that the past few days had been an anomaly, a brief fantasy that was always destined to end when reality returned. But Thomas seemed determined not to let their connection fade entirely. He found small ways to let her know he was thinking of her, a smile when no one else was looking, a casual question about her day that showed he'd been paying attention, a book left on the kitchen counter with a note suggesting she might enjoy it. The gestures were subtle but meaningful, and they kept alive the hope that maybe what they'd found together wasn't entirely impossible. That hope was tested when Caleb Whitmore came to dinner. Caleb was Thomas's cousin, a man of 33 who worked in real estate and had opinions about everything. He was handsome in a polished way, charming when it suited him, and possessed of the casual cruelty that sometimes came with inherited wealth. Evelyn was serving dessert when the conversation turned to Thomas's social life. "I heard through the family grapevine that Aunt Margaret has been trying to set you up again," Caleb said with a laugh. "Any luck with the latest candidates?" "I'm not really interested in being set up," Thomas said mildly, but Evelyn could hear the tension underlying his words. "Come on," Caleb pressed. "You're 30 years old and single. People are starting to talk." "Let them talk," Thomas said. "That's easy to say when you don't have to live with the consequences," Mrs. Margaret interjected. "Your reputation affects the whole family, Thomas." Evelyn tried to focus on clearing the table, but she could feel the weight of the conversation settling around her like a heavy blanket. "Maybe Thomas has his eye on someone already," Caleb said with a sly grin. "Someone he's keeping secret from the family." The words were said jokingly, but Evelyn saw Thomas stiffen in her peripheral vision. She carefully stacked the dessert plates, willing herself to remain invisible. "Don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Margaret said sharply. "Thomas knows better than to get involved with anyone unsuitable." The word hit Evelyn like a slap. She fumbled one of the plates, catching it just before it could shatter on the floor. When she looked up, she found Thomas watching her with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Perhaps we could discuss my personal life when we don't have an audience," Thomas said quietly, his gaze pointedly, including Evelyn in his definition of audience. Caleb followed Thomas's look and seemed to notice Evelyn for the first time. His eyes raked over her with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl. "Of course," he said, but there was something knowing in his smile that made Evelyn's stomach turn. She finished clearing the table as quickly as possible and escaped to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she loaded the dishwasher. The word unsuitable echoed in her mind, along with Caleb's speculative look and Mrs. Margaret's sharp tone. She was lost in anxious thoughts when Thomas appeared in the kitchen, his face tight with frustration. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately. "I'm fine," Evelyn said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "What Caleb implied, what my mother said, none of that was about you personally," Thomas said. "They don't even know you." "But they know what I am," Evelyn said quietly. "And that's enough." Thomas was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been guilt. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "It's not your fault," Evelyn said, though part of her wondered if it was. If she hadn't allowed herself to believe, even for a few days, that the barriers between them could be ignored. "It is my fault," Thomas said, "because I've been selfish. I've been thinking about what I want without considering what it might cost you." The word sent panic through Evelyn's chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should step back before anyone gets hurt." Evelyn felt something break inside her chest, sharp and sudden. "If that's what you think is best." "It's not what I want," Thomas said urgently, "but maybe it's what's smart." "Smart," Evelyn repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. "Yes, I suppose it would be smart to remember our places." "Evelyn, that's not what I meant." But she was already turning away, unable to look at him without feeling the weight of her own foolishness. For a few brief days, she'd allowed herself to believe that someone like Thomas could see past her circumstances to the person she was underneath. But when pressed, when it really mattered, he was choosing safety over courage, just like everyone else in his position would. "I understand," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "It's better this way." Thomas stood there for a moment longer. She could feel him wanting to say something else, but whatever it was, he kept it to himself, and eventually she heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. That night, lying in her small apartment above the garage, Evelyn stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that this was for the best. She'd kept her job, avoided a messy situation, and learned an important lesson about the dangers of reaching beyond her station. But no amount of practical thinking could ease the ache in her chest or erase the memory of how it had felt to be seen, really seen, by someone who made her believe she was worth more than her circumstances suggested. For the first time in 3 years, Evelyn seriously considered looking for another job. 2 weeks passed in a careful dance of avoidance. Thomas threw himself into business meetings and social obligations, while Evelyn perfected the art of being present but invisible whenever he was around. They spoke only when necessary, their interactions polite and professional. But underneath the surface, Evelyn could feel the tension building like pressure in a storm. She told herself she was getting used to the distance, that the sharp pang in her chest when she heard his voice was fading. But late at night, when the house was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, she knew she was lying to herself. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when the Whitmores hosted a dinner party for potential business partners. Evelyn had spent the day preparing the house, arranging flowers, polishing silver, and making sure every detail was perfect for Mrs. Margaret's critical eye. She was in the kitchen putting finishing touches on the appetizers when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Thomas seems more settled lately," she heard Mrs. Margaret saying to one of the guests. "We're hoping he'll announce an engagement soon." "Oh, how wonderful," came the reply. "Anyone we know." "Catherine Morrison," Mrs. Margaret said with satisfaction in her voice. "Henry Morrison's daughter. She's a lovely girl, well-educated, from a good family, perfect for Thomas." Evelyn's hands stilled on the serving tray. Catherine Morrison. She knew that name from the society pages, a blonde, polished woman who attended charity galas and had graduated from an expensive college. "When might we expect an announcement?" the guest asked. "Soon, I hope," Mrs. Margaret replied. "Thomas needs to stop this bachelor nonsense and settle down with someone appropriate. Catherine would be ideal for maintaining the family's reputation." Evelyn felt like she couldn't breathe. She set down the serving tray with shaking hands and gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. Appropriate. There was that word again, cutting through her like a knife. She forced herself to finish preparing the appetizers, carried them to the dining room on autopilot, and served the guests with her usual invisible efficiency. But inside, something was crumbling. Thomas was seated at the head of the table, looking handsome in his dark suit, playing the perfect host. When she set a plate in front of him, their eyes met briefly, and she saw something flash across his features, surprise, concern, maybe even regret. But he said nothing, and she moved on to the next guest. After dinner, as she was clearing the dessert plates, she overheard Thomas's father speaking to him in the hallway. "Your mother told the Morrisons you'd call Catherine this week," Henry was saying. "Don't disappoint her, son. This connection could be very beneficial for the business." "I understand," Thomas replied, but his voice sounded strained. Evelyn hurried past them toward the kitchen, not wanting to hear any more, but Thomas's voice stopped her. "Evelyn, could you bring coffee to the study in 10 minutes? She nodded without looking back, afraid of what he might see in her face. In the kitchen, she prepared the coffee service with mechanical precision, her mind spinning. So this was how it would end, not with an honest conversation or even an acknowledgement of what had passed between them, but with Thomas moving on to someone suitable while she continued to serve his family as if nothing had ever happened. She was arranging cups on the silver tray when Lydia appeared beside her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lydia observed. "I'm fine," Evelyn said automatically. "No, you're not." Lydia studied her face with concern. "What happened?" Evelyn's composure cracked slightly. "They're planning Thomas's engagement." Lydia's expression softened with understanding. "Oh, honey. I should have listened to you," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have been more careful." "Hey," Lydia said gently, placing a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're human, and he's hard to resist when he wants to be." "It doesn't matter now," Evelyn said, straightening her shoulders. "I just need to do my job and remember my place." But even as she said the words, she knew they felt like ash in her mouth. She carried the coffee service to the study, where Thomas was alone, staring out the window at the dark gardens. He turned when she entered, and the look on his face made her heart clench. "Close the door," he said quietly. Evelyn hesitated. I don't think that's wise. Please. Against her better judgment, she closed the door and set the coffee service on the side table. Will there be anything else? Evelyn, we need to talk. No, she said firmly, not looking at him. We really don't. You heard what my parents were saying tonight. It wasn't a question, and Evelyn didn't bother to deny it. Congratulations. Catherine Morrison is a lovely choice. I haven't agreed to anything, Thomas said urgently. My mother's getting ahead of herself. It doesn't matter, Evelyn said, finally meeting his eyes. Whether it's Catherine Morrison or someone else, it was always going to be someone appropriate, someone who fits into your world. That's not fair, isn't it? Evelyn's voice was quiet but steady. 2 weeks ago, you decided we should step back because it was the smart thing to do. Tonight, your parents are planning your engagement to someone they approve of. It seems like everything worked out exactly as it should. Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. You think I wanted this? I think you chose this, Evelyn said. Maybe not consciously, but you chose safety over whatever we had. What we had was real, Thomas said fiercely. What we have is real. Was, Evelyn corrected. Past tense. She turned toward the door, but Thomas caught her arm gently. Evelyn, please, don't give up on us. The touch of his hand on her skin sent electricity through her, and for a moment she wavered. But then she remembered Mrs. Margaret's satisfied voice discussing wedding plans, and she pulled away. There is no us, she said. There never really was. I was just foolish enough to think there could be. She left him standing in the study and went back to the kitchen, where she finished cleaning up from the dinner party with methodical precision. When the house was finally quiet and the guests had gone home, she climbed the stairs to her small apartment and began to pack. She'd been thinking about looking for another job for weeks. It was time to stop thinking and start acting. The next morning, Evelyn submitted her resignation to Mrs. Margaret, citing a family emergency that required her to relocate. Mrs. Margaret accepted it with polite regret and agreed to let her finish out the week. Evelyn managed to avoid Thomas for most of Friday, but Saturday morning he cornered her in the laundry room. Lydia told me you're leaving, he said without preamble. Evelyn continued folding towels, not trusting herself to look at him. I gave proper notice. Mrs. Margaret was understanding about the circumstances. What circumstances? What family emergency? It's personal. Evelyn, please. Thomas's voice was raw, with something that might have been desperation. Don't leave because of me. Don't leave because of what my family said or what they're pressuring me to do. I'm leaving because it's time, Evelyn said, finally meeting his eyes. Because I've learned that some dreams are too expensive and some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. You're using my own words against me. You were right the first time, Evelyn said. We both just forgot it for a while. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. What if I told you I love you? The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the folding table to steady herself, feeling her carefully constructed resolve beginning to crumble. Don't, she whispered. What if I told you that every day for the past 2 weeks has felt wrong without you? That I can't eat in that kitchen without remembering how it felt to have real conversation for the first time in my life? That the thought of marrying someone my parents chose makes me feel like I'm suffocating? Thomas, stop. What if I told you that I want to choose you? That I want to choose us, regardless of what anyone else thinks? Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten. You had your chance to choose me. When your cousin was making jokes and your mother was talking about suitable connections, you chose to protect yourself instead. I was scared, Thomas admitted. I was scared of what it would mean for you, for your job, for your future. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself, Evelyn said, opening her eyes to look at him directly. And that's understandable. It's even smart. But it's also the truth. Thomas looked stricken. So that's it? You're just going to leave? Yes, Evelyn said, though the word felt like it was tearing something vital inside her. I'm going to leave, and you're going to call Catherine Morrison, and in a few months you'll have a beautiful wedding that gets written up in all the society magazines. And eventually, you'll forget that any of this ever happened. I will never forget you, Thomas said with quiet intensity. Then I hope remembering hurts, Evelyn said, surprising herself with the venom in her voice, because you could have chosen differently. You could have been brave, but you chose comfort instead, and I hope that choice follows you for the rest of your life. She pushed past him and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the laundry room. She made it to her apartment before the tears came, violent sobs that shook her whole body and left her gasping for breath. For the first time since she'd started working for the Whitmores, Evelyn allowed herself to grieve, not just for what she'd lost, but for what might have been if either of them had been brave enough to fight for it. Sunday passed in a haze of packing and final preparations. Evelyn had found a temporary position with another family across town, nothing as nice as the Whitmore estate, but honest work that came with a small apartment. It would do until she could figure out what came next. Mrs. Margaret inspected her work one final time and pronounced herself satisfied. "You've been an excellent employee, Evelyn. I do hope your family situation resolves itself favorably." "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret. I appreciate the opportunity you gave me." It was a perfectly polite exchange, professional and distant, giving no hint of the emotional turmoil that had preceded it. Thomas was nowhere to be seen as Evelyn loaded her few possessions into her car. She told herself she was grateful for that, but part of her had hoped for one last conversation, one final chance to… What? Change his mind? Change hers? She was securing the last box in her trunk when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She turned to find Thomas approaching, his face drawn and his usually perfect hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. "I called Catherine Morrison," he said without preamble. Evelyn's heart sank, though she tried not to let it show on her face. "Congratulations." "I called her to tell her I wouldn't be asking her out," Thomas continued. "I told my parents this morning that I won't be manipulated into a marriage for the sake of business connections." Evelyn stared at him, not sure she'd heard correctly. "What?" "I told them that if they want to merge with Morrison Industries, they can find another way to do it, because I'm not going to sacrifice my happiness for their ambitions." "Thomas," Evelyn began, but he held up a hand. "I'm not done," he said. "I also told them that I've fallen in love with someone who makes me want to be a better man, someone who sees past the money and the expectations to who I really am underneath, someone brave enough to build a life on her own terms instead of waiting for someone else's approval." Evelyn felt her knees go weak. What did they say? They said I was making a mistake. They said I was throwing away everything they'd worked to build. They said a lot of things, most of which I'd rather not repeat. Thomas stepped closer, and Evelyn could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but also something else, determination. But they also listened, and by the end of the conversation, I think they understood that I was serious. "Serious about what?" "Serious about you," Thomas said simply. "Serious about us. Serious about choosing love over comfort, even if it's harder." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the bitter tears she'd cried the night before. "It will be harder," she said. "Your family may never accept me. People will talk. It won't be the easy life you could have with someone like Catherine Morrison." "I don't want an easy life," Thomas said, reaching out to take her hands. "I want a real life. With you." "Thomas," Evelyn whispered, afraid to hope. "Stay," he said. "Or if you still want to leave, let me come with you. Let me prove that I meant what I said about choosing you." Evelyn looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never seen before. Not just love, but the kind of quiet courage that comes from finally knowing who you are and what you want. "Your family. We'll have to learn to live with my choices," Thomas said firmly. "I'm 30 years old, Evelyn. It's time I started making decisions based on my own heart instead of their expectations." For a moment, they stood there in the afternoon sunlight, hands clasped, on the verge of something that would change both their lives forever. "Are you sure?" Evelyn asked. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. Everything changes." "Everything already changed," Thomas said. "The moment you let me see who you really are, everything changed for me. I just took too long to admit it." Evelyn looked at the car packed with her belongings, then back at Thomas's face, and made her choice. "Help me unpack," she said. The smile that spread across Thomas's features was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Are you sure?" "I'm terrified," Evelyn admitted, "but I'm sure." As they carried her boxes back toward the house, Evelyn caught sight of Mrs. Margaret watching from an upstairs window. The older woman's expression was unreadable, but she didn't look away. Whatever came next, it would be complicated and difficult, and probably painful at times. But as Thomas's hand found hers while they walked up the front steps together, Evelyn realized she was finally ready to stop hiding from the possibility of happiness. Some risks, she thought, were worth taking after all. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Evelyn had ever experienced. Thomas kept his promise to choose her openly, but that didn't make the transition easy for anyone involved. Mrs. Margaret maintained a frosty politeness that could have frozen fire, while Mr. Henry retreated into cold disapproval that somehow felt worse than outright anger. The other staff members watched the unfolding situation with fascination and barely concealed whispers, though Lydia remained steadfastly supportive. "You're braver than I ever gave you credit for," Lydia told Evelyn one morning as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "I don't feel brave," Evelyn admitted, kneading bread with perhaps more force than necessary. "I feel like I'm walking on ice that could crack at any moment." "But you're walking," Lydia pointed out. "That's what matters." The truth was that Thomas had transformed since making his declaration to his parents. The quiet resignation that had always shadowed him was gone, replaced by a purposeful energy that changed how he moved through the world. He'd started working fewer hours, delegating more responsibilities to his business partners, and spending his evenings reading in the kitchen while Evelyn cooked instead of attending endless social obligations. "I've been thinking," he said one evening as she prepared dinner. He was sitting at the kitchen island with a book, but his attention was clearly on her rather than the page. "About what?" Evelyn asked, chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. "About leaving this house." Evelyn's knife stilled. "What do you mean?" "I mean finding our own place, somewhere we can build a life together without constantly navigating my family's expectations." Thomas closed his book and looked at her directly. "I know it's a big step, but staying here feels like we're trying to grow a garden in ground that's been poisoned." The metaphor was surprisingly apt. Despite Thomas's declaration and their decision to be together openly, the atmosphere in the Whitmore house remained tense and watchful. Evelyn still technically worked as the maid, though the dynamic had shifted in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. "Your family would see it as abandoning them," Evelyn said carefully. "They'll see it as choosing my own path," Thomas corrected, "which is exactly what it would be." "Where would we go?" "I've been looking at houses in town, nothing too grand but comfortable. Somewhere you could have a garden if you wanted one, and I could set up a proper home office." His voice grew tentative. "Somewhere we could be ourselves without anyone watching or judging." The idea sent a thrill of possibility through Evelyn's chest, followed immediately by practical concerns. "What would I do? For work? I can't just not work." "You could do whatever you wanted," Thomas said. "Start your own catering business if cooking is what you love, or take classes, learn something new. We'd figure it out together." That night, Evelyn lay awake thinking about Thomas's proposal. The idea of leaving the only security she'd known for years was terrifying, but the thought of building something entirely their own was undeniably appealing. The decision was made for them the following week when Caleb arrived for another family dinner. Evelyn was serving the soup course when he made a comment that cut through the polite dinner conversation like a blade. "I have to say, Thomas, this whole situation is fascinating," Caleb said with the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be friendly. "Dating the help is one thing, but actually flaunting it at family dinners? That takes commitment." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn felt her face burn with humiliation as every eye at the table turned toward her. "Caleb," Mrs. Margaret said sharply, "that's enough." "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," Caleb continued, seemingly oblivious to the warning in his aunt's voice. "It's like something out of a soap opera. The wealthy heir and the—" "Finish that sentence," Thomas said quietly, "and you'll leave this house tonight and never be welcome back." The menace in Thomas's voice was unmistakable. He'd half risen from his chair, his hands flat on the table, every line of his body radiating controlled fury. Caleb's smirk faltered. You were just insulting the woman I love in my family's home," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. The woman who has shown more grace and dignity in the past month than you've managed in your entire privileged life. Thomas, Mr. Henry began, but Thomas cut him off. No, Thomas said, turning toward his father. I'm done pretending this is acceptable. Evelyn has been nothing but respectful to this family, and in return, she's been subjected to snide comments and barely concealed hostility. It ends now. Mrs. Margaret looked stricken. Thomas, please sit down. We can discuss this privately. We've had months to discuss this privately, Thomas said, and nothing has changed. You still see Evelyn as someone beneath our notice, someone who doesn't deserve basic courtesy, let alone respect. Evelyn wanted to disappear through the floor. Every nightmare she'd had about this situation was playing out in front of her, but worse than she'd imagined because Thomas was making it into a public confrontation instead of letting it pass. Thomas, it's fine, she said quietly. I can handle... No, Thomas said, his eyes never leaving his family's faces. It's not fine, and you shouldn't have to handle it. He turned back to Caleb, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. You have two choices. You can apologize to Evelyn sincerely, or you can leave. Right now. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Caleb mumbled something that might have been an apology, and excused himself from the table. After he left, the dinner continued in strained silence. Evelyn finished serving the meal mechanically, acutely aware of the tension crackling through the dining room like electricity before a storm. Later, as she cleaned up in the kitchen, Mrs. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Evelyn, she said quietly, may I speak with you? Evelyn nodded, her stomach tight with apprehension. Mrs. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Evelyn with the same assessing gaze she'd used that first day when she'd returned from vacation. I owe you an apology, she said finally. The words were so unexpected that Evelyn nearly dropped the plate she was drying. Mrs. Margaret, I've been unfair to you, the older woman continued, not because of anything you've done, but because of what you represent. Change, a disruption to the life I thought my son would live. I never meant to disrupt anything, Evelyn said carefully. I know, Mrs. Margaret said, and that's what makes this harder in some ways. If you were some gold digger or manipulator, I could simply hate you and be done with it. But you're not. You're a good person who makes my son happy in ways I've never seen before. Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that. Thomas has been different since he met you, Mrs. Margaret continued. Stronger, more confident in his own judgment, more willing to fight for what he believes in. She paused. Tonight was the first time I've ever seen him stand up to the family like that. He was protecting me, Evelyn said. He was protecting what matters to him, Mrs. Margaret corrected. There's a difference. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Mrs. Margaret said something that surprised Evelyn even more than the apology. If Thomas chooses to leave this house to be with you, I won't stand in his way. Mrs. Margaret, I won't pretend to understand this relationship, the older woman said. I won't pretend that it's what I would have chosen for him. But I can see that he loves you, and more importantly, I can see that you love him. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. I do. Then perhaps, Mrs. Margaret said with the faintest suggestion of a smile, it's time for this old woman to learn that love doesn't always follow the rules we set for it. 3 months later, Evelyn stood in the kitchen of a small house on Elm Street, packing dishes into boxes while Thomas assembled furniture in the living room. The house was a fraction of the size of the Whitmore estate, but it was theirs, the first home either of them had ever chosen for themselves. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been difficult conversations, hurt feelings, and moments when Evelyn wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. But there had also been morning coffee shared without anyone watching, evenings spent planning their future without having to whisper, and the simple joy of waking up each day knowing they were choosing each other freely. Thomas had indeed left the family business, though not entirely. He'd negotiated a consulting arrangement that gave him more flexibility and allowed him to pursue the teaching position he'd dreamed of. The local community college had offered him a part-time position teaching business history, and watching him prepare for his first classes had shown Evelyn a side of him she'd never seen, passionate, engaged, alive with purpose. For her part, Evelyn had started a small catering business, working with Lydia, who had become her business partner as well as her friend, to provide services for local events. It was challenging work, but it was hers in a way that working for someone else had never been. "I think the bookshelf is winning," Thomas called from the living room, his voice muffled and slightly frustrated. "Do you need help?" Evelyn called back, smiling as she taped up another box. "I need someone who actually knows which end of a screwdriver to hold," Thomas replied. Evelyn laughed and headed toward the living room, where she found Thomas sitting on the floor, surrounded by pieces of what would eventually become a bookshelf, holding an instruction manual upside down. "You're a business consultant," she said, settling beside him. "Surely you can figure out some basic assembly." "I can analyze market trends and develop investment strategies," Thomas said with mock dignity. "Furniture assembly is apparently beyond my skill set." They worked together to sort through the pieces, and Evelyn was struck by how domestic and normal it felt. No formal dining rooms or marble floors, no invisible boundaries or careful distances, just two people building a life together, one small piece at a time. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked suddenly, looking up from the instruction manual. "Right now, or in general?" "Both." Evelyn considered the question seriously. "Right now, I'm frustrated because you've somehow managed to lose 3 screws already and we haven't even started assembling anything." Thomas grinned. "And in general?" "In general," Evelyn said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "I'm happier than I ever thought I had the right to be." "You had every right," Thomas said seriously. "You've always had the right to be happy, Evelyn. I just hope I can help make that happen." "You already do," she said simply. That evening, they sat in their small backyard garden. Evelyn's first garden, planted with her own hands in soil that belonged to them. Thomas was grading papers for his upcoming class, while Evelyn planned menus for a wedding reception she was catering the following weekend. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and somewhere in the distance they could hear children playing and the sound of families settling in for the evening. "Do you ever miss it?" Evelyn asked. "The big house, the social events, the life you could have had?" Thomas looked up from his papers, considering the question. "Do you know what I miss most about that house?" "What?" "The kitchen," he said. "Because that's where I first really saw you. Where we first talked like real people instead of employer and employee. We could have saved ourselves a lot of trouble if we'd just stayed there," Evelyn said with a smile. "No," Thomas said seriously. "We couldn't have. We needed to leave to find out who we really were together. We needed space to grow without anyone else's expectations crowding us." As if summoned by their conversation, Evelyn's phone rang. The caller ID showed Mrs. Margaret's name, and she answered with some trepidation. "Hello, Mrs. Margaret." "Evelyn, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting your dinner." The casual endearment still surprised her, though Mrs. Margaret had been making an effort to bridge the gap between them over the past few months. "Not at all. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I was wondering if you and Thomas might join us for dinner this Sunday. Nothing formal, just family." Evelyn looked at Thomas, who had been listening to her side of the conversation. He nodded encouragingly. "We'd like that very much," Evelyn said. "Wonderful. Oh, and Evelyn?" "Yes?" "I've been telling people about your catering business. I hope you don't mind, but I may have secured you several clients for the spring social season." Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise. Mrs. Margaret recommending her services to Charleston society was more than just a business favor, it was acceptance. "Thank you," Evelyn said, meaning it deeply. "That means a great deal to me." "You're family now," Mrs. Margaret said simply. "Family helps family." After she hung up, Evelyn sat quietly for a moment, processing the conversation. "She called me family," she told Thomas. "You are family," Thomas said, setting aside his papers to give her his full attention. "You've been family since the moment you let me see who you really are." "It's just," Evelyn struggled to find the words. "I never expected her to come around. I thought she'd always see me as the maid who overstepped her boundaries." "My mother is stubborn and set in her ways," Thomas said. "But she's not stupid. She can see what you've brought to my life, what you've brought to our family. And despite her initial resistance, she values happiness more than she values appearances." "Most of the time," Evelyn added with a smile. "Most of the time," Thomas agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead. Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought them here, from those first careful conversations in the Whitmore kitchen to this moment in their own garden, building their own life on their own terms. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, painful conversations, and the constant challenge of proving that their love was strong enough to overcome the barriers that society had placed between them. But they'd done it, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the steady daily choice to choose each other despite the complications, through Thomas's willingness to risk his family's approval and Evelyn's courage to believe she deserved more than safety and security. "I love you," Thomas said quietly, as if he'd been reading her thoughts. "I love you too," Evelyn replied, and the words felt like a promise, not just of feeling, but of commitment to keep choosing each other every day, no matter what challenges might come. 6 months later, they stood in that same garden surrounded by friends and family, exchanging vows they had written themselves. Mrs. Margaret wept during the ceremony, and Mr. Henry walked Evelyn down the aisle with a dignity and grace that spoke of genuine affection. Lydia was the maid of honor, resplendent in a dress the color of spring leaves, while Thomas's best friend from college served as best man. The guest list was small but meaningful, people who had supported them through the difficult months and who genuinely celebrated their happiness. As they kissed to seal their marriage, Evelyn thought about her grandmother's words. "Everyone has a story that would surprise you if you took the time to hear it." Their story had surprised everyone, including themselves. A love that began in a kitchen between two people who thought they knew their place in the world, but who discovered that the heart doesn't recognize boundaries when it finds its home. It was a story about courage, the courage to see beyond circumstances, to risk comfort for authenticity, and to believe that love grounded in respect and understanding could overcome the weight of other people's expectations. But mostly, it was a story about choice, the daily choice to choose love over fear, honesty over convenience, and each other over the easier path. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife in the garden they'd planted together, Evelyn knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that was enough to build a lifetime on. The end.